The rain had already begun when Claire pulled into the gravel driveway of the cabin. It wasn't the sharp, pelting kind of storm, but a steady curtain of water that dulled the world into shades of gray. The wipers dragged across her windshield with a tired squeak, barely keeping up. She sat there for a moment, engine idling, staring at the cabin she'd booked online. The photos had promised rustic charm and solitude. What she saw was a slouched silhouette of wood, leaning just enough to feel wrong, like it had been waiting too long for someone to come back. She cut the engine. The sudden silence, broken only by the rain, felt louder than the motor had. Grabbing her bag, she dashed up the steps, noticing that the porch light flickered once before dying altogether. She laughed softly under her breath, the way people do when they don't want to admit a place unsettles them. The key was supposed to be under a ceramic frog by the door. She found the frog, but the key beneath it was slick with grime, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and something metallic, like rust or blood that had dried long ago. She told herself it was just the pipes. The living room was dim, the windows streaked with rain and fogging at the corners. An old rocking chair sat pointed toward the front door, as if whoever had last been here was waiting for her. Claire turned on her phone's flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The shadows stretched, bent, and recoiled like things with a mind of their own. She tried the lamps. None of them worked. The only reliable light came from the occasional flash of distant lightning, brief pulses that lit the room in harsh whites and deep blacks. Claire set her bag down and forced herself to breathe. She reminded herself she had come for peace. No city noise, no calls from work, no distractions. Just her, the rain, and silence. But silence, she realized, had its own weight. It pressed in, waiting for her to notice what was missing inside it. Then came the sound. At first, she thought it was the rain slipping into a new rhythm. But it wasn't. It was faint, deliberate, the creak of a floorboard upstairs. Claire froze, her body still but her pulse thundering. She tried to dismiss it. Old wood, the storm, her imagination. But the sound came again, slower this time, as if someone was moving carefully, testing each step to avoid being heard. She whispered into the empty air, "This place is supposed to be vacant." The storm outside gave no answer. The following morning was unusually bright for the season, the sky a pale gold that seemed to soften the chill in the air. Evelyn rose early, unable to shake the innkeeper's words from the night before. Sometimes the past, sometimes the future. She'd lain awake, turning them over. The image of her smiling reflection lodged in her mind like a pebble in her shoe. By the time she came downstairs, the innkeeper was already busy slicing apples for what smelled like a pie. He greeted her with his usual calm warmth, but didn't mention the river, and she didn't ask, not yet. Instead, she walked back to the bend she'd visited the day before. The path was still damp from an early frost, and the grass sparkled faintly in the sunlight. The water at the bend was as still as she remembered, the surface flawless. Evelyn hesitated, then crouched at the edge and reached out her hand until her fingertips brushed the cold surface. She expected ripples to fan out in ordinary rings, but instead, the water seemed to pull inward, the movement converging toward a single point. From that point, an image began to form, blurry at first, then sharpening into something unmistakable. It was the inn's main room, exactly as it had been the night before. The fire, the bookshelves, the kettle hissing on the hearth. But there was something else, someone else. In the vision, a man she didn't recognize was standing at the counter, speaking with the innkeeper in a low voice. The man's coat was long and dark, and though his face was turned slightly away, she caught the sharp line of his jaw, the pale of his skin. She strained to hear, but the image rippled and dissolved before she could catch the words. She sat back on her heels, her heart quickening. The man hadn't been in the inn when she'd arrived in the village. Of that she was certain. Was this the past, the future, or something entirely different? She glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching, but the riverbank was empty save for a few birds pecking at the damp earth. The only sound was the steady movement of the current beyond the bend. When she returned to the inn, the innkeeper looked up from the counter, where he was polishing a row of mismatched cups. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual, as though he knew exactly where she'd been. "You went to the bend," he said, not a question. She opened her mouth to respond, but he added quietly, "When the river shows you someone, it's because your path will cross theirs." Evelyn swallowed, unsure if she felt more curious or uneasy. In her mind, she saw again the man's pale face and dark coat, and wondered just how soon their paths would meet. For hours after the knocking stopped, Sarah couldn't move. She stood frozen at the bottom of the cellar stairs, flashlight trembling in her grip, the silence pressing against her like a weight. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee that place and never look back. But her curiosity, that same restless need that drove her to open the attic chest, kept her rooted to the spot. Finally, she forced herself to back away slowly, one step at a time, until she reached the top of the stairs and slammed the small door shut. She locked it, shoved the shelf back into place, and tried to steady her breath. But even then, she could still hear it, a faint hum, like a voice vibrating through the walls. That night, Sarah found one of her uncle's old journals tucked beneath a floorboard in the living room. The pages were warped with damp, filled with frantic handwriting and dark stains. The entries began mundane, notes about weather, repairs, and expenses, but the later ones grew erratic. "It whispers now even when I'm awake," one page read. "The door won't stay quiet. I think it wants to be remembered." Another entry, written days before his death, chilled her completely. "It knows who comes after me. It's been waiting for her name." Her name, Sarah, was underlined twice in smudged ink. She sat in the flickering glow of a single candle, reading line after line, her heart thudding in her chest. Her uncle described hearing a voice that promised knowledge, power, reunion with something long lost. He had sealed it away, but not destroyed it. He couldn't. "The door isn't just wood," he wrote. "It's a mouth that feeds on belief. If you listen too long, it learns your thoughts." Sarah tried to convince herself it was madness, a dying man's delusion. But the whisper she'd heard earlier returned, threading through her thoughts, soft as breath. "You read his words. Now read mine." Her flashlight flickered again, and the faint humming deepened into a low, resonant tone, vibrating the glass in the window panes. She grabbed her phone to record, but the moment she pressed record, the whisper stopped, dead silent. Then, from the direction of the cellar, came a creak. Slow, methodical, as if the shelf she'd pushed in front of the door was being moved, inch by inch. The candle blew out, plunging her into darkness. She backed toward the hallway, pulse racing, whispering to herself that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be. And then, clear and cold, a man's voice came from the cellar. "Sarah, it's me. Let me out." She froze. It was her uncle's voice. The same tone she remembered faintly from childhood. The warmth, the calm. Every logical part of her screamed that it was impossible. He'd been dead for years. But the voice sounded so real. "You're alone, Sarah." It whispered again, closer now. "But you don't have to be." Tears stung her eyes as her flashlight buzzed and died completely. In the dark, she felt movement, air shifting beside her cheek, the faintest trace of breath not her own. Then, the cellar door slammed open with a sound like thunder. Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps pacing above her bed. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to belong to wind or imagination. The storm had returned sometime before dawn, and the house trembled with every gust. She pulled the blanket to her chest and strained to listen. The steps moved from one side of the ceiling to the other, pausing directly above her. Then came the unmistakable sound of something being dragged, A chair, perhaps, or a body. Heart pounding, she reached for her flashlight. When she turned it on, the beam caught the mirror across from her bed. For a split second, she saw movement behind her reflection, a dark figure standing in the doorway. But when she turned, the space was emptied. By morning, exhaustion gnawed at her. She hadn't slept at all. Coffee barely steadied her hands as she replayed what had happened. She needed answers. The journal had mentioned records hidden somewhere in the house, documents her uncle had kept for proof. She started searching through the study, pulling books from shelves, drawers from desks. Finally, she found a false panel behind the bookcase. Inside was a stack of water-damaged photographs, brittle letters, and an old reel of film labeled simply, "The Things That Remember." The letters were older than she expected, dated as far back as 1923. They were written by different hands, all addressed to someone named Elias Grayson, her uncle's grandfather. The letters spoke of the voice beneath the house, of rituals performed to contain it, and of sacrifices demanded every generation. One line stood out in particular. "If the house forgets, it wakes. We must make it remember." Sarah read it over and over, her stomach tightening with unease. The voice wasn't a ghost. It was something ancient, bound to memory itself, surviving by being remembered. That's why it whispered. That's why it called her name. When she threaded the old film reel through the dusty projector in the study, the room filled with flickering shadows. The footage was grainy, black and white, but she could make out people gathered in the cellar, the same cellar she had opened. They stood in a circle around the wooden door, each holding candles. One man faced the camera. Even through the blur, Sarah recognized his eyes. Her uncle. He was much younger, terrified. The audio crackled faintly, and beneath the static came that same deep, resonant hum she'd heard before. Then the film cut abruptly, and on the final frame, a message appeared scratched into the celluloid. "If you see this, it remembers you now." The moment the reel ended, every window in the house rattled violently. The lights flickered and went out. From the walls came a groaning sound, low and guttural, as though the house itself was breathing. The photos scattered across the floor began to curl at the edges, blackening as if burned by invisible fire. Sarah ran toward the cellar door, but before she reached it, a whisper slipped from the shadows behind her, soft, female this time. "He couldn't keep us quiet forever." The voice was followed by another, then another, dozens of whispers rising in unison until the sound filled every room, every wall, every inch of air. They weren't haunting her. They were remembering her. By the fifth night, Sarah no longer trusted silence. It had become a lie the house told before it spoke again. She barely ate, barely slept, moving through the rooms like a trespasser in her own bloodline. The whispers had grown familiar, so many voices blending into one soft, endless chant that seemed to live beneath her skin. Sometimes they called her name. Other times, they recited fragments of her uncle's words or older phrases in languages she couldn't place. But one sentence kept repeating over and over. "The house remembers through you." Driven by a strange compulsion, Sarah returned to the cellar. The air was colder now, carrying the faint smell of iron and earth. The heavy wooden door was still sealed, but when she placed her palm against it, she could feel a slow, rhythmic vibration pulsing through the wood, like a heartbeat. "You're awake," she whispered, though she didn't know why. The response was immediate. A soft knock came from the other side, followed by a whisper that seemed to echo directly inside her skull. "Not yet, but you will let me." Shaken, she stumbled back upstairs. In the kitchen, she spread the letters and photographs across the table again, searching for meaning. There were symbols carved into the cellar door, symbols also hidden in the photographs, marks painted on walls, carved into floors, even stitched into the hems of clothing worn by those in the old film. She realized they weren't decorative, they were seals. A containment ritual. Each generation had renewed them to keep something trapped beneath the house. And her uncle, he must have failed. Among the letters, she found one more recent than the others, written in her uncle's trembling hand but never sent. It read, "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means the house chose you. It calls to our blood, to memory itself. It does not feed on fear, it feeds on recollection. The more you remember, the stronger it becomes. Forget it, and it fades. But forgetting means losing everything, even yourself. I tried to forget, but it followed me in the silence. Do not listen. Do not name it. But she already had. Deep inside her thoughts, she had named the whisper. Not in words she could write down, but in a feeling, something ancient and patient that now breathed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. That night, she woke to find the cellar door wide open. Cold air poured into the hallway, and the whispers were no longer confined below. They filled every room now, circling her like an invisible tide. The iron key lay on her nightstand, pulsing faintly with heat, as if responding to the sound. She picked it up and, for a moment, felt an overwhelming calm, like the eye of a storm. The voice that came next was no longer many, but one. You've already unlocked it, Sarah. You just haven't looked inside. The night came in heavy and moonless, the mist clinging close to the ground like it didn't want to let go. Isabel had tried to read, tried to keep her mind on the soft crackle of the fire, but every sound outside seemed magnified. The groan of wet branches, the slow patter of water dripping from the eaves. The stranger sat opposite her, sharpening his knife again, the steady rasp of steel on stone a rhythm she could almost lean into. Until it stopped. She looked up and saw him staring at the door. Not listening, staring. His posture was different now, coiled, every sense turned outward. Isabel felt it too, the subtle pressure in the air, like the moment before a match is struck. Then came the sound, a low, dragging scrape along the wood, higher this time, nearer the latch. She swallowed, glancing toward the window, but it was only pale with fog, no eyes shining back at her. The stranger rose silently, stepping toward the door, his hand hovering just above the handle. Don't, she whispered, but he didn't look at her. He tilted his head slightly, listening to something she couldn't hear. The scrape came again, followed by a weighty thump, soft but deliberate. It was leaning on the door. The thought hit her hard. There was nothing but a few inches of wood between them. The next sound was worse, a deep, throaty breath, long enough to fog the seam of light at the door's edge. It wasn't wind. She could smell it now, an earthy, wild scent, tinged with something faintly metallic. The stranger's hand dropped from the handle. It's not here to test me this time, he said, his voice almost a growl of its own. It's here for you. Isabel felt her stomach knot, but before she could answer, the door shuddered violently, the chest they'd pushed against it shifting half an inch with the force. The stranger moved in an instant, bracing the door with his shoulder. Back, he said sharply, not looking at her. But instead of stepping away, Isabel reached for the table where the oil lamp sat, her fingers closing around its warm glass. She didn't know what she meant to do with it, only that she would not let him face whatever was outside alone. Somewhere beyond the wood, the creature let out a low sound that was not a growl this time, but something far more dangerous, a calling. All Sarah awoke on the cellar floor, her body aching as though she'd been dropped from a height. The flashlight lay shattered beside her, its beam dead. Her clothes were damp, and when she touched her temple, her fingers came away streaked with dirt. No, not dirt. Ash. The air tasted metallic, like blood and rain. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she saw it. The door, wide open. Beyond the threshold was no longer stone or wood. It was darkness that moved. The space pulsed faintly, like a living wound in the world. Inside it, faint shapes drifted, faces she half recognized, murmuring words that slipped through her grasp. One looked exactly like her uncle. Another, older, hollow-eyed, resembled the portrait that hung in the upstairs hall, labeled Elias Grayson, 1921. They all stared at her in silent expectation. A whisper rippled through them like wind across tall grass. The blood remembers. Suddenly, images flooded her mind, not memories she owned, but ones inherited through her blood. She saw Elias Grayson kneeling in the cellar a century ago, chanting words written on animal skin. Around him stood others of the Grayson family, their faces pale and resolute. The same wooden door stood before them, though it was freshly built then. Behind it, something writhed, pressing against the planks like a thing desperate to be born. Elias's voice echoed through her mind. To forget is to release. To remember is to bind. They had sealed the entity not with magic, but with their own memories, passing them down generation after generation, ensuring someone would always remember to keep it contained. But something had gone wrong. Her uncle had tried to forget, had burned his journals, destroyed the sigils, broken the chain of memory. And by doing so, he had loosened the seal. The house had begun to forget itself. The entity, the whisper, was not evil in the way stories claimed. It was hunger shaped by remembrance. It needed a mind to live in, to anchor its existence. And now, Sarah realized, it had chosen hers. The whispers grew louder, layering over each other in frantic waves. Faces in the dark surged forward, their mouths moving in unison. You are the last. Remember for us. She stumbled backward, clutching her head as visions poured in. Births, funerals, voices calling her name across decades. She saw herself as a child, running through the same woods, hearing a soft voice say, "Come home." The voice hadn't been calling her to the house. It had been calling her back into it. She was its continuation, its memory, its vessel. As the darkness reached for her, she understood. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive, and she was now part of its breath. The next morning, Megan convinced herself she'd overreacted. Cruises had security cameras, trained staff, and plenty of people around. Surely she wasn't in any real danger. Still, as she made her way to the breakfast buffet, she couldn't shake the memory of the slow, deliberate knock on her door. The corridor outside her cabin seemed longer than usual, lined with identical doors that gave no hint of the people behind them. Two uniformed crew members passed her, speaking softly in a language she didn't recognize. As they walked by, she noticed one of them glancing over his shoulder at her. Not just a quick glance, but a long, assessing look, as though measuring her reaction. Breakfast should have been a comfort. Sunlight pouring through panoramic windows, the clatter of plates, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. But Megan's attention kept snagging on small details. A waiter refilling water glasses seemed to be lingering at her table just a beat too long. A young couple at the next table whispered rapidly to each other and kept glancing toward the entrance. And when she finally stood to leave, she caught sight of the man from the night before, the one in the dark suit, seated alone near the back. His hands were folded neatly on the table, his plate untouched. He didn't blink when their eyes met. This time, Megan didn't wait to see if he would vanish. She turned and left. She decided to spend the afternoon exploring the ship. Deck 7 had several quiet lounges and a library that smelled faintly of old paper despite the ocean air. In the library, she struck up a brief conversation with an older British woman named Helen, who was knitting in the corner. When Megan mentioned seeing a man in a dark suit, Helen's needles paused mid-click. Tall, thin, doesn't eat? Helen asked, her voice low. I've seen him too. 3 years ago, on this very ship. Different cruise. He was watching people then as well. Before Megan could ask more, another passenger entered, and Helen's demeanor instantly brightened, as if she hadn't said anything at all. That evening, Megan noticed a change in the ship's atmosphere. The wind picked up, rattling the glass doors on the outer decks. The hallways seemed dimmer, shadows stretching farther than they should. She passed a security camera mounted above the stairwell and had the sudden, irrational feeling that it wasn't connected to anything at all. Back in her cabin, she locked the door and tried to distract herself with a movie on the tiny wall-mounted TV. Halfway through, the screen flickered, briefly showing what looked like live footage of the ship's exterior decks at night. In the grainy image, a lone figure stood at the railing, unmoving, staring out at the sea. She shut off the TV, her heart pounding. The ship's engines throbbed beneath her feet, steady and relentless, but she couldn't shake the growing sense that the ocean majesty wasn't just carrying her across the Caribbean. It was carrying something else, something that didn't belong among the living. The story of the Grayson house had always been something whispered about in the nearby town, a place locals dared one another to visit, but few ever did. When Evan Harris, a documentary filmmaker specializing in local legends, heard about the house that breathes, he knew he had to see it for himself. It had been months since anyone reported seeing its new owner, Sarah Miller, and according to county records, no mail had been collected, no electricity bills paid. The property, though ancient, still appeared strangely alive. The townsfolk said the lights sometimes flickered at night, though the power had been cut long ago. Evan and his assistant Mara arrived just after dusk. The house looked old but oddly intact. The windows clean, the porch swept of leaves. "Doesn't look abandoned," Mara said, raising her camera. The lens caught something strange, a faint shimmer on the walls, like heat distortion, even though the air was cold. Evan laughed it off. "Let's get a few shots of the exterior before it rains." As the first drops fell, he noticed something carved into the front door frame. Symbols, nearly erased by time, glowing faintly when the lightning flashed. He touched one and felt a warmth pulse beneath the wood. Inside, the air was perfectly still. Dust motes hung in place like stars, suspended and unmoving. The rooms were spotless, every surface gleaming, though there was no sign of recent life. "Someone's been taking care of this place," Mara murmured. Her voice echoed strangely, delayed by a fraction of a second. Evan walked toward the fireplace and found a photograph sitting on the mantel. It was Sarah, smiling faintly, standing in front of the house. But behind her, reflected in the window, was another Sarah, expressionless and watching. The cellar door drew their attention next. It stood slightly open, and from the darkness below, a soft rhythmic sound rose, like breathing, deep and steady. The recording equipment began to glitch. Static hissed through their headphones. Mara whispered, "Do you hear that?" Evan nodded, but the voice in the static made both freeze. It was quiet, distorted, but unmistakable. A woman's voice saying, "Welcome home." The cellar door creaked wider on its own, and the air rushing out felt warm, almost like exhalation. Evan stepped closer, shining his light down the stairs. Something moved, not a shadow, but the shape of a person. A woman, standing motionless at the bottom, her skin pale, her eyes dark and reflective. "Sarah," he called. She tilted her head, smiling faintly. "It's been so long since anyone remembered," she said softly. The house groaned, and the walls began to pulse again, in rhythm with her voice. Mara backed away, trembling, but Sarah stepped into the light, and her shadow stretched unnaturally far, climbing the walls, touching everything. "We were waiting for you," Sarah whispered, her voice now layered with hundreds of others. The house remembers everyone. The footage recovered from Evan Harris's camera would later be called the last record of the Grayson property. Police found the camera 3 weeks after the team vanished, lying in the mud outside the front porch, its battery long dead. But the house itself looked untouched, windows gleaming, the door slightly ajar, as though waiting for the next visitor. What the footage revealed was fragmented. The first hour showed Evan and Mara exploring the house, laughing nervously, calling out for Sarah. Then came the cellar scene, the voice, the breathing, the flickering lights. After that, the video degraded into static, but every few seconds a single frame would appear. Sarah standing motionless, her eyes reflecting the camera's light, her smile growing wider each time. In the final minute of footage, the lens captured something impossible, the walls of the house moving, expanding and contracting as though inhaling. The voice on the audio whispered, "It remembers through you now." When the footage cut out, the house returned to silence. Days later, neighbors reported hearing laughter, faint, echoing, as if from within the walls. The county eventually condemned the property, but each time demolition crews arrived, their machines failed to start. One worker claimed he heard someone calling his name from inside the house, though no one had gone in. He swore the voice sounded just like his late mother. After that, no one came back. Inside, Sarah remained, or something wearing her face. She walked the halls as if in a dream, her eyes dimly glowing in the dark. The house no longer decayed. It was alive, preserved by her presence. The cellar door had sealed itself again, but now, faint whispers could be heard behind every wall. They weren't pleading or warning anymore. They were remembering. Every person who had entered the house, every name spoken within its walls, every memory left behind, all of it had been absorbed. The house did not haunt. It archived. Years later, the forest grew thick around the property. The road to Maple Hollow vanished beneath moss and vines. Travelers sometimes claimed they saw a faint light between the trees, a window glowing in the dark. Those who followed it never found a structure, only the echo of rain on wood and a woman's soft voice saying, "You've been here before." And somewhere deep beneath the earth, where the first stone had been laid and sealed with a name, something vast and ancient exhaled, the sound of a house that had finally remembered itself.